So to begin our exploration in secondary learners and secondary literacy, I want to first take a moment to recognize the fact that secondary literacy has different priorities than primary literacy, right? So these are the basics of reading on the screen. These are also the chapters from the reading playbook, and we will be looking at those in this course. However, we're going to be looking at them through a different lens and under an umbrella, because we have these skills that are essential to learning reading when we are new learners. But these skills are established under the assumption that these new readers are early readers. They're young, they're little. And as our learners grow and become adolescents, becoming towards the secondary level, they still need these skills. And if they are missing these skills, they still need to be taught. But they need to be taught under the umbrella of secondary literacy instead of just in isolation, or they won't have very much effect on the child's reading and literacy abilities as a whole. If we take a secondary student and we pull them and put them on a phonics program that focuses just on phonics, ignoring the other requirements for secondary literacy, it may not have any effect at all. It might have some, but it might not have any at all, and it definitely would not have as much effect as it would if we considered the other aspects of secondary literacy. So on that note, let's look at what those are. The umbrella of literacy does cover the basic reading skills. Those are still there and still need to be kept in mind and are essential. They need to be skills that are taught, that these children need to know in order to read. If they don't have them, they will not be able to read. They will struggle, right? However, under that umbrella of literacy, there are three things that cover the basic reading skills. We have the idea of the adolescent brain, because we are talking secondary level. We have the Bloom's taxonomy, and we also have the Scarborough's rope. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about those three things right now. Okay, so Scarborough's reading rope, if you haven't seen it before, it's on the screen. You should look it up, spend some time looking at it. It's this concept that we have these basic reading skills, and you'll notice that on the bottom strand that is blue and green, we have those basic reading skills, right? But after you have those skills, at some level, they get intertwined with this other rope that is oranges and reds, and they can't be separated. And those skills are our verbal reasoning, language, structure, vocabulary, background knowledge, literacy knowledge, right? So if we have learners who are further on in their reading journey because they're secondary level, they're 13 years old, and they're missing maybe the green strand of decoding, but they're already mixed in with these other skills, these other pink and blue and orange skills that they have started to develop because they are secondary learners. It's impossible to just pull the green strand out, right? We can't just teach them the green strand when they're already mixed in there, right? We have to teach it while it's being intertwined with the other skills. Bloom's taxonomy we are all familiar with as educators, but I want to bring it up here when we talk about secondary literacy, because when we look at the Alaska Reading Playbook, the skills that are taught in it only go up to understanding, remembering, and understanding. And it's important to note that in the secondary level, literacy isn't just comprehension, right? It's the ability to analyze, to synthesize, to evaluate, to apply this information. We want to read a textbook and be able to apply it to this now skill in science because I'm doing a science lab and I just read this text about it. There has to be these other skills, this higher level thinking that is being used by our learners, right? And so if we have a struggling reader that is having a hard time remembering sight words, that doesn't necessarily mean that they haven't grown in their thinking ability and they can't apply information. So it does a disservice to them to think that we just need to teach them just sight words again when they have such a higher level thinking ability already. But we still need to make sure that those holes in their thinking do get covered. Okay, the final part of secondary literacy, that is the umbrella and what this sort of unit is covering, is the idea of what adolescents are, who they are, how their brains function. Okay, we tend to function under some misconceptions about adolescents, that they're weird, that they they have bad impulse control, they make bad decisions, they give into peer pressure, and they're just hormonal, they're just so hormonal, right? And not all of that is true, and some of it is based in some reality. But when we try to teach literacy to secondary students without actually understanding the adolescent brain, we're not going to make it very far, right? That goes for really all learning, but specifically when it's something that they may be struggling with, or they may feel that they should have gotten early on, it's even more important to keep in mind their secondary brain and how they function, right? So I have some bullet points here that are just some basic things to keep in mind when we're talking about adolescence. The discussion for you is to explore one of the resources that's below this video, actually two resources, one on each side, one about the actual brain of adolescents, how it develops, and the other one about adolescents' identity and their sort of goals as adolescents, and to talk about how that should affect and maybe drive our decision making when we are teaching literacy. So this is just an overview of some of the things you might explore in those articles. One thing that we need to keep in mind with adolescents is that sometimes there's this misconception that they're just like hormonal adults. They start looking like adults, their bodies develop, and they start having adult feelings. However, their brains actually in MRI scans look more like toddlers than adults, because at toddlerhood, 2, 3, 4 years old, is the only other time in an individual's life that there is that much brain development going on as there is with adolescents. They are having huge brain changes, which makes a lot of things happen. I had toddlers a couple years ago. They're finally out of that stage, but there was often times when I'd have a discussion with my toddlers at home, and then I would go to school and have a similar discussion with adolescents. They don't lose their skills and their knowledge in adolescence as toddlers, but their ability to deal with their emotions, to make decisions, to react to things they don't like, a lot of that reverts back to toddlerhood as their brains are changing so drastically, so quickly, until that starts settling out, right? Another thing that you should know about adolescents is they are 100% driven by their identity, and almost always that comes through their peers, their social circle, right? So in this stage of development, it's identity versus role reversal. Their goal in adolescence, in human development, is to establish an identity. It is so important to them, and that identity almost always has to be established in some sort of group. Regardless of what that group is, they might have a peer group of 2 people that just love to watch anime together. And they might have a peer group that is athletic and popular and cares about dating and things like that, right? It doesn't really matter what their peer group is, but they must fit into that group and feel like that's part of their identity. It is part of their goals as adolescents. Another thing that we need to keep in mind about adolescents is it's not just hormones that makes them crazy. It's actually more about the brain development than the hormones, right? The excess hormones do make them more emotional and have stronger emotions, but that doesn't affect their ability to process and deal with those emotions. It doesn't affect their ability to think and make decisions and their impulse control. The major things that make adolescents maybe a little bit unstable is more about the brain changes. Because their prefrontal cortex is starting to develop. That's huge, right? But at the same time, they're doing synaptic pruning, sorry about that, which means that all of the connections they've already made in their brain, the brain decides which one of these we want to keep and which ones we want to get rid of, like what are we going to specialize on. And then the ones that we want to specialize in, the connections that we're going to keep in the brain, they're going to put myelin around to establish and make it a hard connection, right? So it's a very important, the learning at this time, that what adolescents focus their time on is what is going to make solid connections that will be very hard to unlearn later. Very, very, very hard, right? Another thing that's really important, this is one thing about their hormones that's really important to know when we were talking about teaching them. Not so much the romantic hormone things. No, it's that dopamine increases significantly in adolescence. And dopamine is directly tied to that synaptic pruning. I don't know, I'm having a hard time saying that, right? So if one of those connections is firing and there's no dopamine present, the brain goes, I don't need this one, and doesn't put myelin around it and lets it go. But if one of those connections is firing and the individual also gets a dose of dopamine at the same time, the brain automatically goes, I want this more, I'm going to put myelin around this and make this a solid connection and have it happen again. Which means that adolescents don't learn without dopamine present in their brain. They have to be having fun in order to learn something. They might be able to memorize something short term, but for it to become a skill that they can use for life, dopamine must be present in their brain. Adolescents are more tired than any other time in human development. The melatonin that we naturally get when it's sort of time to sleep, in the adolescent stage, they get that released in their brain much later in the evening than before. So they actually have a harder time falling asleep early, which then means they also have melatonin in their system much longer into the next morning than they would at a younger age, which explains why we have adolescents who stay up late. We have adolescents who have to get up early then for school and are extremely tired and maybe groggy for a few hours, right? And the final thing that we need to think about when we're talking about adolescents is they will be skeptical of everything. It is a part of their goal as adolescents, that identity-driven, it is the main goal for them in this time of growth is to establish their identity and to be skeptical of everything to see if it is something that they actually want to be a part of their identity and make solid connections in their brain about. Okay. Now, that was a very brief introduction to just adolescent brain. You're going to explore the articles more to see some of the research and some more understanding of that. And I know that this isn't directly related to literacy, but it is because we're talking about secondary students. We cannot separate secondary literacy from the secondary adolescent brain, or we will not be able to implement literacy in the secondary classroom.